Sometimes they have a life review, and the life review really fascinates me quite a lot, because with the life review they can see everything that's ever happened to them in their life, the significant things and the insignificant things. But what is interesting is that sometimes they can experience this from a third person perspective, so they can feel the impact that their actions have had on other people. So for example, one man said to me that he could remember when he was young, he suddenly found himself in the schoolyard with his friend, and he was making fun of his friend, and he went up and he slapped his friend across the face. And he said, as soon as I did that, I felt like I was in that boy's body, and I felt that slap across my face, I felt that humiliation, and I felt the tears welling up inside me. And he said it gave me a completely different perspective on what I'd done. And he said it was so insignificant, I'd even forgotten about it. But then he said conversely as well, nice things that he'd done. He could remember helping a lady to cross the road. She was laden down with groceries, and he went up to her and he'd helped her across. And he said, I felt how relieved that lady was that she was able to cross the road safely. And he said that gave him a completely different perspective as well. And so I think the life review is very, very interesting, because that can really instigate a lot of life changes after the experience as well.
Can I jump in there? Because one of my associates, a guy called William Murtha, and Bill has written a book called Dying for Change. And in it, Bill had a circumstance. I don't know do you know of the Bill Murtha story?
Yeah.
Okay. Bill was riding along the sea wall in Dawlish, again in 1999. It seems to be quite a passing over year, 1999. And Bill was cycling along the sea wall. I think it was one night in March, or one evening in March, around about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. And as he was riding along the seawall, a wave knocked him off his bike, knocked the bike to the ground, and he got up to try and pick up the bike. And as he did so, another wave came over and flew him off the seawall into the ex-estuary. He fell about 40 feet into the sea, and then he found himself being drawn out because the tide was going out. So he was in this situation of sudden realization. Nobody knew he was in the sea. It was freezing cold, and he started to suffer from hypothermia. As the hypothermia started to kick in, he had the most amazing sensations take place. The first thing he did say to me was, if anybody tells you that hypothermia is a nice way to die, it's not. It really, really hurts, because you feel all your organs cutting out, and it's very, very painful. But what he then sensed was, and he had something, the students of you who are interested in the philosophy of these ideas will come across the work of somebody called Buck, who in the late 19th century wrote a book about the idea of universal consciousness, the idea that we're all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. I know that was Bill Hicks as well, but we might come on to that later. But Buck was the first person to do that. And he said as he was in the sea, the seagulls were flying over, and he felt he was the seagulls. He felt he was the cliffs. He felt he was the water around him. And then suddenly, he said, a voice started talking to him. A disembodied voice started to guide him and say that this is not how it should be. And then the next second, he said he was like shooting out of his body at great speed. Again, people I know who've taken dimethyltryptamine and ayahuasca have told me they have the same sensation of shooting out their body. He then found himself running across a road in East London when he was a child. And he's running across the road, and he said, as I'm running across, I look up and I see a car coming towards me. And the car hits me, and I hear my leg break, feel the pain, and I fall to the ground. I'm out of my head again, and then I'm looking down at a woman's leg, and it has a ladder in its stocking. And she's fiddling around with the ladder on her stocking, and then she looks up, and he realizes she's driving a car, as she sees a little boy run across the street, and she hits him. He felt all the fear, the terror, and everything else that woman felt when she hit him when he was a child. Now, these were evoked memories that he only had a vague recollection of at the time. Now, this is again intriguing, because then he found himself back in his body again. And I won't go into details, but if you get hold of Will's book, it's very, very well reading, because how he was saved. In fact, the incident was so famous at the time. It was on, there used to be a thing called 999 with Michael Burke, where people were saved. It was featured on that TV program. Not the events that took place in the out-of-body experiences or the near-death experiences, but the experiences of him being saved. But what was then strange, he was shown an alternate future, and he found himself a point of consciousness looking down the hallway of his house. And he heard a knock on the door, and he saw his wife and 2 daughters go to the door. The door was open, and a police officer was standing there, and the police officer said, "We've got terrible news, your husband's body has been found on the beach in Dawlish." And the voice in his head said, "This is what could be." Now, I was reminded of A Christmas Carol in many ways, because this is very similar to A Christmas Carol. And what he then did was, he was saved in the end, and he changed his life. He turned his life around, and he's now a lecturer, and he writes books and everything else. Now, to me, there were 3 themes there. There was the past life review, there was the future life review, there was the alternate futures that could be, and there was also the feeling of oneness with everything. Now, from your cases and your experiences, have they been reported before? Have people told you that they get this feeling?
Yes, they have. And in fact, now you brought that up, it reminds me of a case that I came across a few years ago. I'd worked with a doctor, and I'd worked with him for quite a few years. And what you find with doctors as well is that some of them have actually had experiences themselves, but they won't talk about them. And I think as my nursing career and my research progressed, as the years went by as well, more doctors would come up to me and said, "Well, I actually did have an experience, but I didn't want to tell you before." And so there's quite a few of them who've had them. And I find with doctors, they try and rationalise it as well. There's one who said, "Oh, he said, this happened when I was in the dentist, and I had the out-of-body experience, went into this beautiful place. But he said, you know, I was hypoxic at the time, I'd had all those drugs." And I thought he was saying that. He had no evidence that he was hypoxic at the time. So that's what you find with doctors. But this one case in particular, the doctor was swimming, and he got into difficulty swimming, and he started drowning. And he said, "I was gasping for breath, and I was getting more and more tired, and I was going under the water." And he said, "That was it. I went under, and I sank down to the bottom of the ocean." And during that time, he said he'd seen a life review of his own life, and it got to the point where he could see himself at the bottom of the ocean. But then he said, "I could see myself lying in an open coffin." And he said, "My parents were there, and they were looking down, and they were really sobbing and crying." And he said that was what was happening to me. And I had that choice, that I could stay where I was and that would happen, or I had the choice to come back. And he said he just found himself back, being pulled out of the water, and someone pressing down on his chest, and lots of water coming out of his mouth.
Well, I suppose this is an example, isn't it? Probably some of you will have come across the books of Ibn Alexander III. And Ibn Alexander was a neurologist who was a very, very grounded materialist reductionist, was famous for the work he had done. And he went into a very deep coma after he had complexities, I think, with meningitis. Now, Alexander, when he was in this state, had a full classic near-death experience. Now, up until that stage, he'd always believed it was some kind of hallucination, some kind of just death trauma, some kind of an accommodation for the fact you're dying. But because he'd actually experienced it himself, the one thing he said was that the experience was more real than this reality. Now, this is a very, very important point, that we assume that this reality is the real reality, and the reason we assume this is because it's consensual. In other words, we all share it. If I have an hallucination, the major definition of a hallucination is it's me having it on my own. In other words, I'm seeing things that aren't there in external reality, therefore I am crazy. However, we then have this little rule, don't we, that if I share that experience with somebody else and somebody else also has that experience, it's still not explained, and the materialist reductionist will turn around and say it's a folie à deux. In other words, 2 people have shared this crazy vision, but it's still not considered to be an anomaly because they've given it a label, they've given it a name. Then you get a large group of people who will see a collective hallucination. It's called mass hysteria. So, for example, we will have the case of the people seeing the sun spin in the sky at Fatima. Thousands of people saw that happen. Explanation? Collective hysteria. So exactly at what point is something considered to be objectively real if the definitions of hallucination are broadened to such an extent that anything that doesn't fit in with the accepted worldview is labelled an hallucination just because they want to label it that way. Now, the thing is, with near-death experiences, even Alexander, his experiences were incredible, and he again had a Peake-Darien experience during that, because in the sequence, he was flying on the back of a bird, a huge winged bird. On the back of the bird, there was a young woman who was talking to him. He subsequently discovered, when he came out of the coma and he survived, he knew he'd been adopted, but he didn't know that he actually had a sister who had died very young. And I think I'm right in saying he saw photographs of her afterwards.
Yes.
And it was the girl he saw in the sequence. Now, was he exaggerating? What on earth would Ibn Alexander have to gain by taking a risk on his career and his reputation by writing this book? He had no idea it was going to become a worldwide bestseller. All he knew was he'd had an extraordinary experience that he wanted to write down. And this is because anybody who has these experiences, they become real. And that's our problem, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, absolutely, it is. And that brings me back to the point as well of empathic death experiences. And this can happen when people who are dying, the people at the bedside with them, can actually share in a partial journey into the light with that person. And I think the best example of this is a man who wrote to me over 10 years ago now. And he said, I've heard of your work and I wonder if you could help me, because I had this experience when my wife died and I've never been able to understand it. He said they were in the hospital, him and his family. His wife was in the bed. He said, my daughter was at the top of the bed and she was stroking my wife's forehead like this. I was holding her hand at the side of the bed and my son was the other side of the bed. And he said, all of a sudden, my daughter said, look, can you see Mum? She's on a path. She's walking on a path. And he said something happened and it was as if this big light kind of appeared and everything appeared in front of him. And he said he was walking alongside his wife up this path. And at the end of the path was a big, tall man standing there with expectant arms open like that. And he said, I got so far up the path with my wife and then I couldn't go any further. We watched my wife go to this man. He gave her this loving embrace. And he said, I felt so much at peace. He said, I've never felt such peace in my life before. My daughter was watching it all as well. And he said at that point, the hug with his wife and the man, his wife's breathing stopped and she actually died in the hospital bed. And so the vision just kind of stopped for him. But he said, that has left me with such a great sense of peace. He said, that should have been the saddest day of my life. Both my daughter and myself had big smiles on our faces because of what we'd experienced, that emotion that was generated in both of us. The son didn't have any experience himself, but he still felt a sense of elation as well. But he said the nurses must have thought that we were really insensitive because my wife had just died and we had these wonderful feelings going on and we had big smiles on our faces. And that's something he's never really been able to understand. And I spoke to his daughter separately and she said, that experience has left me with absolutely no fear of death at all. She said, that was just so wonderful and so beautiful. So you've got those experiences as well, and it changes people, it changes the way they grieve. And so there's something profound about these experiences that makes them different from other kinds of hallucinations.
Because that is the central part of your book as well. It's not just the descriptions, it's the transformational elements of what a near-death experience transforms the worldview of the experiencer. Can you
That's right. Now, after the experience, people are really profoundly transformed in many ways. For example, they can be more loving, more tolerant, and more compassionate towards other people. They can have a deeper empathy with other people. Things that were once of importance to them, all of a sudden that importance goes, like material possessions, having nice big cars, having lots of money. Those things don't mean anything to them anymore. They don't care. Their goal is no longer to earn lots of money or things like that. Their goal changes, and it's things like simple things, spending time with their family and their loved ones, spending time in nature. So there's those worldviews and their values, and in fact the values change so drastically in some cases that there can be quite a high divorce rate in people who've had a near-death experience. There's other changes as well, some which are particularly fascinating to me because they are potentially quantifiable. Now, some people feel after the experience their electromagnetic field has changed, and sometimes they don't associate this as being part of their near-death experience. So some people can't wear wristwatches, they will just stop working for no reason at all. They could be the wind-up ones or they could be digital ones, but they just won't work. One lady who I used to work with said, when she qualified as a nurse, she was given this really expensive watch, and she said she couldn't wear it because it broke down for her. Took it to the jewellers, they had a look at it, it was working fine for them, worked fine for other people, but not her. Electrical items, computers, kettles, toasters, anything like that will malfunction as well. Credit card machines, they stop working for some people as well. Quite handy, really. And it's just things like that. And so that's one aspect I'd like to do more research on, because that's something that we can potentially quantify as well. Some people feel that they develop a healing technique as well, or some sort of healing ability. So one man I spoke to said after his near-death experience, he was intuitively drawn to people who had, say, an illness. Say one lady had a frozen shoulder. He didn't know this lady. He just kind of walked past her in a shopping mall. And he went up to her and he said, do you mind if I put my hands on your shoulder? So he did, he just put his hands there, and that kind of released that frozen shoulder that she was experiencing. So you get those abilities as well. And if we had some sort of understanding of those abilities, we could really help other people as well with that. What other changes are there? Yeah, so people are just profoundly transformed in many different ways, and I think it's very important that we look at those changes as well, because some things could be of benefit that we could develop for healthcare purposes as well.
I think it's one of the major issues, isn't it, that when somebody has an experience, a transformational experience like this, the difficulty is ever explaining it to anybody else. I mean, an example that I've cited quite a few times, and it really affected me many, many years ago when I came across a description that a blind child had asked her mother as to what colour was the wind. Because effectively, as far as she was concerned, as a child that had been born blind, she had been told that everything had colour. So therefore she believed that the wind had colour. And it's the difficulty of explaining certain transformational experiences in a language that we can actually share. Because sometimes a view across the barriers, as it were, is a viewpoint on an alternate universe, and a universe that's greater than ourselves that we can't describe to our fellow human beings. But indeed, on a philosophical point, it could be that we're not supposed to be able to describe this, because effectively, if we did know that there was life after death, or there was an alternate state outside of time, we are embodied in here. So therefore, if we have to go through the stages of being in here in order to move on, to have the transformational experiences. Now, one of the areas I've written about in my recent books is the idea of this being some form of computer simulation. And there is strong evidence from quantum physics, there's strong evidence from a lot of research that's been done by people like Vlatko Vedrell and some of the world's leading particle physicists at the moment, that this is a simulation. So in which case, if we're existing in a simulation, the basis of everything is not matter, the basis of everything is information. And we are living within an informational matrix. So therefore, if we have a near-death experience, what we do is we have a glimpse of the program. In other words, we drop out of the matrix as we'd like to think, like Neo does when he actually has the opportunity after meeting Morpheus, whereby he sees the matrix as it really is. And I would argue that near-death experiences are one of those states where you come back, where you've seen the reality behind the reality. It's something that the Gnostics used to call a pleroma. So it's something that you'll find in esoteric traditions for centuries. The idea of the reality behind the reality. And the idea that everything is a unity. That everything is a single concept that we are within. which would explain why people, when they have near-death experiences, suddenly have this realization that their body doesn't stop at the end of their body. It extends outwards, because what you do to other people has an effect on you, because you're damaging yourself in another way.